So I have Shari with me this morning as we continue our journey into Valentin Tomberg's Meditations on the Tarot. This time we are picking up with letter 12, the Hanged Man. I think, do you want to start with sharing an image of the on the card, Shari?
Sure.
Okay. You can hold up your book.
Are we on the group thing, or do I have to talk so that my thing shows up? There we go.
I have the views on gallery, so it should be good.
Okay.
Yep. There we are. There's the image.
Yeah.
So upside down. Upside down.
Yeah.
So Tomberg starts off this chapter talking about the principle of gravitation. So I think like that's where we could start the discussion. Is there anything you wanted to say about that? Because Tomberg is obvious, he's using gravitation in a very should I just read that section where he explains what he's talking about?
Why don't you do that?
Okay. So gravitation, physical, psychic, and spiritual, occupies a central place as a regulating factor in the solar system, in the system of the atom, in the biological cell, and the biological organism, in the mechanism of memory and the association of ideas, and the relationship of the sexes, in the social organism, and the formation of communities according to way of life, doctrine and ideal, and lastly, in the process of biological, psychic, and spiritual evolution, where a center of gravity, or universal prototype as the final cause, is at work across the ages, just as the sun, insofar as it is the center of gravity of the planetary system, operates across space. The whole world manifests itself to us as a comprehensive system of gravitation, constituting a number of particular gravitational systems, such as atoms, cells, organisms, planets, individuals, communities, and hierarchies. For each one of us is placed in the cosmic gravitational system which determines our freedom, i.e., what we are able to do and not able to do. The domain of our freedom itself, our spiritual life, shows the real and active presence of gravitation of a spiritual order. For what is the phenomenon of religion, if not the manifestation of spiritual gravitation towards God, i.e., toward the center of all spiritual gravitation of the world? It is significant that the term the fall, chosen for the primordial event which brought about the change of man's state from that name paradise to the terrestrial state of toil, suffering, and death, is borrowed from the domain of gravitation. In fact, there is nothing against the conception of the fall of Adam as a passage from a spiritual gravitational system whose center is God to a terrestrial gravitational system whose center is the serpent, that we have characterized in the preceding letter as the principle of electricity. The fall as a phenomenon can certainly be understood as the passage from one gravitational field to another. Now, the domain of freedom, the spiritual life, is found placed between two gravitational fields with two different centers. The gospel designates them as heaven and this world, or as the kingdom of God and the kingdom of the prince of this world. And it designates those whose will follows or is submitted to the gravitation of this world as the children of this world, and those whose will follows the gravitation of heaven as the children or sons of light. So this is the very, very broad concept that he is talking about when he talks about gravitation. And it relates to the image of the hangman, because you can see for the hangman, he's upside down.
Right.
So that, and he's upside down because for the hangman, the center of gravitation is the celestial sphere, the heavenly gravitation. He's pulled toward God and not toward the kingdom and not toward the serpent. Actually, he's suspended between the two, is what Tomberg goes on to say, because he still has to act in the world.
Yeah, so it says on the first page there, the position of the man upside down, head below, hanging by one foot in a porch, with his free leg folded back at the knee and his arms bound behind his back, at first naturally evokes ideas of gravitation and of the torture that conflict with it, and of the torture that conflict with it can inflict on man. Oh, wait a minute, I have to read that again.
Well, if you're in conflict with gravitation, it can inflict torture, is what he's saying.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Therefore, our first impression of the card plunges us into the heart of the problem of the relationship between man and gravitation and the conflicts that this relationship entails. Yeah.
Right. And in the case of the spiritual gravitation here, he also, right here, he links it to he says it's both a benediction and a martyrdom.
Yeah.
Let's see, trying to figure out, I have a whole bunch, I have so much highlighted. He says these opposing desires are he's talking about the two poles, right?
Yeah.
These opposing desires.
Sorry, I just want to say he's that verse, for the desires of the flesh are against the spirit, and the desires of the spirit are against the flesh.
Right.
Okay.
So he's elucidating that verse from scripture.
Mm-hmm.
These opposing desires are tendencies through which the two gravitational fields manifest themselves. The man who lives in the grip of the gravitation of this world at the expense of the gravitation of heaven is the carnal man. He who lives in equilibrium between the two gravitational fields is the psychic man. And lastly, the one who lives under the sway of the gravitation of heaven is the spiritual man. It is this latter who constitutes the subject of the 12th arcanum of the tarot, for it is an upside down man that the 12th card represents. The hangman represents the condition of one in the life of whom gravitation from above has replaced that from below. Firstly, it should be said that attraction from above is real as real as that from below, and that the condition of a human being who has passed whilst living from the field of terrestrial gravitation into that of heaven is indeed comparable to that of the hangman of the card. This is at one and the same time a benediction and a martyrdom, both very real. And you can see this like really in the lives of the saints.
Yeah.
That simultaneous like benediction and martyrdom.
Of course. Yeah.
I
wanted to just read a portion of Fantastes by George.
Okay.
MacDonald that absolutely has to do with this.
Absolutely.
Okay.
No, George MacDonald is always welcome.
So there's a knight, and he comes across a small child, and let me see here where to start. Sorry, thought I had the right spot.
It's okay. I promise I won't do a Jeopardy countdown on you to make it even more stressful.
Here we go. We're ready to go. May I ask for what the little beggar girl wanted your aid, and when she came to your castle to find you? So the knight is retelling this story, okay? And then he looked at me for a moment in silence and then said, and this is the knight's story, I cannot help wondering how you know of that, but there is something about you quite strange enough to entitle you to the privilege of the country, namely to go unquestioned. I, however, being only a man, such as you see me, am ready to tell you anything you like to ask me, as far as I can. The little beggar girl came into the hall where I was sitting and told me in a very curious way, which I can only recollect very vaguely. It was so peculiar. What I can recall is that she was sent to gather wings. As soon as she had gathered a pair of wings for herself, she was to fly away, she said, to the country she came from. But where that was, she could give no information. She said she had to beg her wings from the butterflies and moths. And wherever she begged, no one refused her. But she needed a great many of the wings of butterflies and moths to make a pair for herself. And so she had to wander about day after day looking for butterflies, and night after night looking for moths. And then she begged for their wings. But the day before, she had come into a part of the forest, she said, where there were multitudes of splendid butterflies flitting about with wings which were just fit to make the eyes in the shoulders of her own wings. And she knew she could have as many of them as she liked for the asking. But as soon as she began to beg, there came a great creature right up to her and threw her down and walked over her. When she got up, she saw the wood was full of these beings stalking about and seeming to have nothing to do with each other. As soon as ever she began to beg, one of them walked over her, till at last in dismay and in growing horror of the senseless creatures, She had run away to look for somebody to help her. I asked her what they were like. She said, like great men made of wood, without knee or elbow joints, and without any noses or mouths or eyes in their faces. I laughed at the little maiden, thinking she was making a child's game of me, but although she burst out laughing too, she persisted in asserting the truth of her story. Only come, knight, come and see, I will lead you. So I armed myself to be ready for anything that might happen and followed the child, for though I could make nothing of her story, I could see she was a little human being in need of some help or other. As she walked before me, I looked attentively at her. Whether or not it was from being so often knocked down and walked over, I could not tell, but her clothes were very much torn, and in several places her white skin was peeping through. I thought she was humpbacked, but on looking more closely, I saw through the tatters of her frock, do not laugh at me, a bunch on each shoulder of the most gorgeous colors. Looking yet more closely, I saw that they were of the shape of folded wings and were made of all kinds of butterfly wings and moth wings, crowded together like the feathers on the individual butterfly pinion, but like them, most beautifully arranged and producing a perfect harmony of color and shade. I could now more easily believe the rest of her story, especially as I saw every now and then a certain heaving motion in the wings, as if they longed to be uplifted and outspread. But beneath her scanty garments, complete wings could not be concealed, and indeed from her own story they were yet unfinished. After walking for 2 or 3 hours, we came to a part of the forest, the very air of which was quivering with the motion of multitudes of resplendent butterflies, as gorgeous in color as if the eyes of peacock feathers had taken to flight, but infinite variety of hue and form, only that the appearance of some kind of eye on each wing predominated. There they are, cried the child in a tone of victory mingled with terror. Except for this tone, I should have thought she referred to the butterflies, for I could see nothing else. But at that moment, an enormous butterfly whose wing had great eyes of blue surrounded by confused cloudy heaps of more dingy coloring, just like a break in the clouds on a stormy day towards evening, settled near us. The child instantly began murmuring, "Butterfly, butterfly, give me your wings." When the moment after, she fell to the ground and began crying as if hurt. I drew my sword and heaved a great blow in the direction in which the child had fallen. It struck something, and instantly the most grotesque imitation of a man became visible. You see, this fairyland is full of oddities and all sorts of incredibly ridiculous things, which a man is compelled to meet and treat as real existences, although all the time he feels foolish for doing so. This being, if being it could be called, was like a block of wood roughly hewn into the mere outlines of a man, and hardly so, for it had but head, body, legs, and arms, the head without a face, and the limbs utterly formless. I had hewn off one of its legs, but the two portions moved on as best they could, quite independent of each other, so that I had done no good. I ran after it and clove it in twain from the head downwards, but it could not be convinced that its vocation was not to walk over people. For as soon as the little girl began her begging again, all 3 parts came bustling up. And if I had not interposed my weight between her and them, she would have been trampled again under them. I saw that something else must be done. If the wood was full of the creatures, it would be an endless work to chop them so small that they could do no injury. And then, besides, the parts would be so numerous that the butterflies would be in danger from the drift of flying chips. I served this one so, however, and then told the girl to beg again and point out the direction in which one was coming. I was glad to find, however, that I could now see him myself, and wondered how they could have been invisible before. I would not allow him to walk over the child, but while I kept him off, and she began begging again, another appeared, and it was all I could do from the weight of my armor to protect her from the stupid, persevering efforts of the 2. But suddenly the right plan occurred to me. I tripped one of them up, and taking him by the legs, set him on his head, with his heels against a tree. I was delighted to find he could not move. Meantime, the poor child was walked over by the other, but it was for the last time. Whenever one appeared, I followed the same plan, tripped him up and set him on his head, and so the little beggar was able to gather her wings without any trouble, which occupation she continued for several hours in my company.
Okay, so tell us why you shared that in connection with The hangman.
Well, to me, that story, what that meant to me before I read the Hangman chapter was that the wooden men were dull, right? Like there's a dullness to them, a dullness of well, how would you say that? Perception. They don't have a face, right? They don't have eyes or ears or anything. And they just, they don't try to kill the girl, but they walk on top of her. So there's this sense that the young girl is doing something out of the ordinary. She's building herself some wings so that she can fly, which is to me symbolic of someone
celestial gravitation.
Ascend. Okay.
Yeah.
Ascend.
Yeah. And the beings that are opposing her, they're like associated with wood, right? So it's something hard and dense, which is reflective of enfoldment of terrestrial gravitation.
Right.
So they're very earthy. So they're representative of the opposing gravitational forces.
Force. And what they do is walk on her. They actually hold her down.
To trample her down.
Right.
To keep her down so that she doesn't elevate.
Yes, it doesn't ascend.
So that she's kept away.
And then George's
there are sins.
George's solution in the fairy tale is for the knight to, the only way that, because when he chops them up, the pieces just continue to autonomously trample the girl.
Resist not evil by force.
Right. So he flips them on their head. And the way that I originally understood it was that they couldn't move because suddenly their world had been turned upside down, right? But when I read the Hangman, it makes even more sense.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So that's why I wanted to read that story.
I could see it as you were reading it, and I'm like, oh, but I don't think I would have. I've heard you read that before, and I don't think I saw that before.
No, yeah, I mean, I always have a sense that that portion of Fantastes was about inversion, right? Because that's what George does. He just inverts everything, right? So that you see it from below, and you have to look like through and up. But yeah, after reading the Hangman, I'm like, oh my goodness. And I don't even think George knows what he did there, but I mean, he doesn't.
But here's the thing, though. Okay, this actually relates to one of the principles that's discussed in the Hangman. He doesn't need to.
I know, yeah. That's
because his will is aligned. Because his will is aligned with heaven.
Right. And this is what I love about this stuff, because nobody has to be in conversation with each other in order for it to just constantly be revealed, right? Like it's sophiological is what it is. That's why, like in Fantastes, it's happening in the woods with butterflies and wooden men, and
Well, let's take it. Yeah, well, I think you can kind of you can see how what Tomberg's talking about here when he's talking about. Maybe we should. I don't want to confuse people, so we should probably talk about what I'm referencing here.
Sure.
Hold on a second, and let me find where he starts talking about it.
What are you going to talk about?
I'm going to talk about will coming before thought and imagination and the spiritual man. Let's see. Well, maybe we'll get back around to that. Hold on.
That's quite a ways ahead, right?
Yeah, that's quite a ways ahead. I feel like we should cover some other ground first.
Well, one thing I did circle here, just after that section that you read on gravitation. Actually, you read it, and I just wanted to point it out because I think it easily goes under. He says, now the domain of freedom, the spiritual life, is found placed between gravitational fields and two different centers. And in the actual sentence, I'm going to just pop it up here because I think it's significant. Where is it? There. Can anybody see that? He's got hyphens on either side of the spiritual life.
Right.
Okay. So is that backwards on here? Probably. so the spiritual life is the domain of freedom.
Correct.
I think that's interesting to point out.
Right.
And it's placed between gravitational fields with two different centers. So
I actually found it. I found the section that I was looking for. So, well, this is one of. He actually goes into a great deal of depth about this. So let's talk about this, because this, you're talking about like, well, George didn't necessarily have to know what he was doing, and I think there's something profoundly right about that. So first of all, he gives the example. Well, actually, it's going to be in the section I'm going to read right now. So let's just go ahead and.
Can you give me the first sentence on the top of the page?
Yeah, it's on the top of the page. It is possible that King David. It's the first thing on the top of this page is a quote.
Okay.
And then the paragraph I'm going to read starts with the other characteristic trait of the spiritual man.
Okay.
Okay. Do you find it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll find it. Just go ahead.
Right. The other characteristic trait of the spiritual man is that he is upside down. This means to say, firstly, that the solid ground is under his feet is found above, whilst the ground below is only the concern and perception of the head. Secondly, it means to say that his will is connected with heaven and is found in immediate contact, not by the intermediary of thought and feeling with the spiritual world. This is in such a way that the will knows things that the head, his thinking, still does not know. And so that it is the future, the celestial designs for the future, which work in and through his will, rather than the experience of memory of the past. He is therefore literally the man of the future, the final cause being the element activating his will. He is the man of desire in the sense of the book of Daniel, and in the sense of Louis Claude Saint-Martin, i.e. the man whose will is set high above the powers of the head, above thought, imagination, and memory. Now, the normal relationship between thought, feeling, and will for a civilized and educated man is such that his thought awakens feeling and directs the will. Thought plays a stimulating role by means of imagination toward feeling, an educative role by means of imagination and feeling toward the will. Having to act, one thinks, one imagines, one feels, and lastly, one desires and acts. This is not so for the spiritual man. For him, it is the will which plays the stimulating and educative role toward feeling and thought. He acts first, then he desires, then he feels the worth of his action, and lastly, he understands. Abraham left his country of birth and went, in crossing the desert, into a strange country, where centuries later a people descended from him was to find its native land, and where several centuries later the work of mankind's salvation was to take place. Did he know all this? Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that he acted as if he knew, his will being enamored with these future things and by their greatness and significance. No, in the sense that he did not have in his thoughts and imagination a plan or clear program concerning how and when and through what stages precisely these things would be realized. And that, my friends, is how poetry is written.
Yep.
If you try to plan it out in advance instead of just writing, it's not going to go very well. You can form and shape it afterwards in your editing, but you have to be just led into the action first. Yeah.
Oh, I finally found it. when you quoted the Abraham thing, I knew where it was.
Okay. So this is what you said about George, I think, is right there, right? So if you're like, that's what he's doing. And that's like, I think most creative acts, you can see this very clearly in most creative acts.
Yeah.
Like truly creative things that are genuinely beautiful.
Well, that's because they're coming from above.
Right. They are coming from above. That's exactly it.
And it also has to do with the imagination, right? Which both Tomberg and George MacDonald see in the same way, that it's a divine dwelling place in a sense.
Right, but neither Tomberg nor Barfield nor Coleridge nor are talking about like the undisciplined and arbitrary imagination when they're talking about that.
No.
So maybe that's a place to go.
The reason that it's not so it has to follow a moral law. George MacDonald talks about this. If anyone's interested, he has a now I can't remember which one it is. There's one essay called The Fantastic Imagination, and then there's one just called The Imagination. I think it might be in the Imagination essay, which is longer. And he talks about the fairy tale being written according to that law, right? That it has to be written according to that law. Otherwise, it's not a fairy tale. Well, it's not anything, actually, in his opinion.
Right.
And the essay is written to teachers in the educational system, and he talks about discouraging the youth from engaging in their fantasy or their fancy, as Coleridge would call it, right? In the undisciplined imagination.
Right.
Yeah, and I would say, just from off the top of my head, that the imaginal, the divine dwelling place, right? The things that come from above come from there. That place is far richer than fantasy itself. Far richer.
Well, yeah, and Tomberg actually elucidates this quite a bit, and he ties it to Goethe. He says, and this is let's see, the top of the page that I'm reading from starts with, there are undoubtedly monstrous conclusions, where he's talking where he's quoting from that bishop whose opinion he's taking to task. And then, so this is, here's what he says. Now, practical Hermeticism is, like Christian mysticism, based on the experience of authentic faith, i.e. the experience of the human being upside down, where the will is above intellectuality and imagination. Its practical aim is nevertheless to render the intellect and imagination equal companions of the will, favored by revelation from above, and here is how it is to be achieved. One moralizes thought in substituting moral logic for formal logic. One makes an entrance for moral worth in the domain of cold thought. At the same time, one intellectualizes the imagination by disciplining it and submitting it to the laws of moral logic. This is what Goethe understood by exact imagination, exact Fantasie. I.e. dispensing with imagination which plays according to free and arbitrary association, and instead applying it to work in accordance with the associations dictated by moral logic, in harmony with the laws of symbolism. It is thus that thought and imagination become capable of being attentive to and participating in the experience of the will receiving favors from above. And then he goes on to talk about moral logic and, oh, Michael Martin.
Oh, how wonderful.
Just filling up. And then he goes on to talk about moral reasoning versus logical reasoning is the next section.
Okay, I'm just gonna read you a little excerpt it's actually the Fantastic Imagination essay from George MacDonald. Hi, Michael.
Go for it.
Hey.
He says, some thinkers would feel sorely hampered if at liberty to use no forms but such as existed in nature, or to invent nothing save in accordance with the laws of the world of the senses. But it must not therefore be imagined that they desire escape from the region of law. Nothing lawless can show the least reason why it should exist, or could at best have more than an appearance of life. The natural world has its laws, and no man must interfere with them in the way of presentment of any more than in the way of use. But they themselves may suggest laws of other kinds, and man may, if he pleases, invent a little world of his own with its own laws. For there is that in him which delights in calling up new forms, which is the nearest perhaps he can come to creation. When such forms are new embodiments of old truths, we call them products of the imagination. When they are mere inventions, however lovely, I should call them the work of fancy. In either case, law has been diligently at work. His world once invented, the highest law that comes next into play is that there shall be harmony between the laws by which the new world has begun to exist. And in the process of his creation, the inventor must hold by those laws. The moment he forgets one of them, he makes the story by its own postulates incredible. To be able to live a moment in an imagined world, we must see the laws of its existence obeyed. Those broken, we fall out of it. The imagination in us, whose exercise is essential to the most temporary submission to the imagination of another, immediately, with the disappearance of law, ceases to act. Law is the soil in which alone beauty will grow. Beauty is the only stuff in which truth can be clothed. And you may, if you will, call imagination the tailor that cuts her garments to fit her, and fancy his journeyman that puts the pieces of them together, or perhaps at most embroiders their buttonholes.
And I think by law here, he means moral law. So he's actually saying the
That's
same
right.
thing that Tomberg says, which
He
is
talks about that further on. I didn't want to read all of it.
yeah, no, it's that moral reasoning is the thing that disciplines the imagination.
He talks about calling evil good and good evil, right?
Right.
That's like breaking this law that he's trying to elucidate here in the essay. But yeah, George MacDonald was all over this chapter for me. Just all over it. All over it.
I'm
But
sure
it's
William.
because it's about the
I'm sure William Blake was all over it for Michael.
Well, yeah, him too, for sure. Yeah.
So Michael, we were just that's the part of the conversation. What we were just talking about was we were talking about the relationship between will, thought, and imagination that Tomberg expresses in The Spiritual Man.
He read from page 316 and 317, so like halfway down. The other characteristic trait of the spiritual man is that he is upside down. Nate just read from that, and on page 317, at the top, this is not so for the spiritual man. For him, it is the will which plays the stimulating and educative role towards feeling and thought. He acts first, then he desires, then he feels the worth of his action, and lastly, he understands. And I thought of the last chapter when I read that, because this acting first without understanding is like being moved by what? A force. That's what it felt like to me when I was reading it, which Tomberg says is virginity, right? Which I think is somehow linked to integrity. So it's like you have this thing that you can't stay sitting, right? You have to stand up and you have to move forward. You have to put one foot in front of the other, and you don't even know why.
Have you ever read Brave New World?
I haven't.
No.
Yep.
There's a scene in toward the end when this one character, Bernard Marx, who's kind of a comical character based on Huxley himself. And there's John the Savage, and John the Savage grew up on a savage reservation, which means he grew up, he lived like we live, basically, and he was outside of the technocracy, and he gets pulled into the technocracy that Bernard's part of. And in the technocracy, they've all been brainwashed from they were never in utero, from in test tubo. So they've all been brainwashed forever. And here they meet this guy who can be authentic. And what happens is the Savage sees all these basically zombies who get this stuff called soma to keep them asleep. It's their Prozac, right? And he's like, "Don't take it, it's poison. It's poison. Don't take it, I tell you." And he takes it and he's throwing it away. And Bernard's inspired and he wants to join him, but he's like, "I should join him, but I can't join him because I have to think about this because what'll happen." He doesn't know how to be authentic. He doesn't know how to be real. And John is right in the will. He's got a healthy will.
Yeah, right. He's led by the.
It's not a perverted will.
Right.
And I think this is it.
It doesn't deliberate.
Like no, he doesn't. He knows what to do, and then you can understand it later. But I had to do this, right?
Yeah, this is exactly what Maximus the Confessor talks about when he talks about gnomic will being the will that does not deliberate, right? I mean, natural will.
Natural
being
will.
the-
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
sorry.
No, that's right. Yeah, because
And the
that's what
gnomic will is the one that deliberates, right? That goes, well, wait, like, you know, I gotta think.
that's the
No.
will that Tomberg is talking about in this chapter, because that's the one that is naturally oriented toward the vertical center of gravitation.
And he gets this from Rudolf Steiner, right? And from Hegel, but in German idealism. But Steiner's thing, right? It was a great introduction, and the introduction to his agriculture lectures, I think written by Aaron Fried Pfeiffer. He talks about having conversations with Dr. Steiner. He says, well, you know, why can't the people who are following you do anything? And like, you know, you give them all these great ideas. Nope, they just gets all messed up because nobody has. Steiner said, it's a problem of nutrition. Modern foodstuffs do not supply the appropriate nutrition to strengthen the will.
Oh, interesting. I love how
that's very
Steiner
So they
thinks.
can't do it.
I
And
love how,
this is when biodynamic agriculture started, right?
Mhm.
And I see this. I mean, I think we all see this, is that good people, you know, it's like Yeats, right? The worst are full, the best do nothing while the worst are full of passionate intensity, right? So they have emotion and they have ideology, but they can't do anything.
Yeah.
And this, I don't know if you've noticed this, but every domain I've worked in, except for the farm, I've seen this over and over again. So it's mostly been in the schools and academia, but also in the music business. People got all these great ideas, great passion, no will.
Mhm.
They can't. And I think it's got to be a
Do you think
problem
that, like,
of
I'm
nutrition.
thinking specifically of like academia. It seems to me that that would be exactly the thing that hinders conversation between disciplines. Because you would
There's
have
that
to
in the
will to
egregore-
wander
it's the
out.
egregore too, right?
Yeah, like you have to will to wander out like Abraham did, right? Like, so I'm a
I don't have to-
biologist, I'm going to talk to a physicist about my ideas. No, I can't wander out because then I'd be out of my own country, right?
Right, there's part of that, but the main thing I've seen in academia is that you got all these people who talk a good, you know, revolution game, but when push comes to shove, they cave immediately, you know. And I saw when Marigrove was closing all those years ago, you know, full professors who they're going to close the school, and they were like, well, we can't push back against the administration. I said, why not? What do they do? They can't fire you more than once.
Yeah.
What are they going to do? Consign you to hell? No, go ahead. You know, and I was not afraid. Of course, that's one of my downfalls. I was not afraid to tell them what I thought about the topic.
Yeah.
But, and I was not in a leadership role at that college ever, but I was kind of thrust into one because not very few people wanted to fight back.
So the way you're talking about this, Michael, it's very, you can see its connection to fear. So I think maybe this would be a good time to talk about how Tomberg talks about the story of Jesus walking on the water, because then you can see
Right.
this connection between like will and fear, like fear
Right.
being the thing that paralyzes the will and keeps it in the terrestrial and keeps it from being able to elevate itself to the celestial sphere of gravitation.
And I see that exactly with Peter. He's cool until he starts thinking about it.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Now I'm scared.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Right.
But it's very different. Like the example I think he uses earlier of the healing of Aeneas, right? When Jesus Christ heals you, he doesn't even think about it, but it is after the coming of the Holy Spirit, right?
Yeah.
But it's kind of interesting because when Jesus shows up on the water, the first thing he says is, don't be afraid, because he anticipates that, right?
Well, yeah. Well, Tomberg spends a lot of time talking about like both the typical translation,
Yeah.
it is I,
It
be
is
not
I,
afraid,
and I am.
be not afraid.
Yeah. Yeah.
And with one being the exoteric and the other being the esoteric meaning.
Okay, but before he does get into that story, he does talk about this tension, remember?
Mhm.
That has to be held. Because this is the, like what you read in the beginning, is that the hangman is between the two worlds.
Because
Right.
and that's necessarily the case, because he can't be elevated all, because he's still a man, right? He's the spiritual man, so he's still a human being, and human beings are meant to be
Well, they're subject
of
to
this
gravity.
earth, right?
Yeah,
So
they're
he's not,
subject.
he can't ascend all the way to heaven because he is a man. But that's because he's a spiritual man, that's the gravitational pull that's upon him. But he has to be suspended between the two worlds, because as a human being, he still belongs to the earth, and he has to act, which is
And the
ties
right
directly to what
position-
Michael is talking about.
Right, but
Like,
the right position for him is between those two worlds, is upside down to us.
and specifically, the reason he needs to be between the two worlds, as opposed to just ascending into heaven, is so that he can still act in the world. And
Well,
when he acts in the world, because his will is aligned with the celestial sphere of gravitation, he is enacting the will of God in the world.
Don't you think
through his
he's
actions.
actually linking heaven and earth in that position? Like he's acting as a mediator between.
Yes, yes, he's acting as a mediator, but more specifically, he's acting as, because of his capacity for action, he's acting as the hands of heaven.
The hands?
Yeah. The
Because
hands
of-
and the feet and the legs and the arms. He's embodying it. That's what the mediation is what I'm suggesting to you, is the mediation is the embodiment of it.
Yeah, I think it's incarnation.
Right,
This
exactly.
conversation-
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just trying to.
Yeah, no. I'm trying to understand it in my own terms, right?
Absolutely.
And I, like we talk about embodiment, and I think people get, unfortunately, a little mixed up, because it's kind of like a gospel of just try harder when you talk about embodiment, in a sense, because then they think that they have to do something, right? Oh, well, then I have to feed the homeless, and I've got to visit the sick, and I've got to go to the prisons, and I got to, but what if it's like a flow state, right? Where that which is above is conducted through you to that which is below.
Mm-hmm.
And that only happens when you're in that inverted position, right? And I think that the inverted position also allows you to see things differently, because, have you ever stood on your head and looked at your environment? It suddenly looks completely different, right? Because you see everything from the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
It has a totally different, like I remember when we lived in Telegraph Creek, we had this huge raspberry patch. And at the end of the season, this old couple from the reserve down the road would come, and they would just pick however much they wanted, because we had enough. And Louis used to lay on his back underneath, in between the rows, and tell his wife where to pick, because he could see everything from the bottom, right? And when you look from the top, the leaves cover the berries and you can't see them. So he would lay on his back in the raspberry patch and go, oh, there's one there just under that big leaf. Oh yeah, and there's another one, and she'd be
That's what I
picking
call
them
executive ability right there.
So anyway, yeah, I think that this is literally the incarnational process, right? Of that which is above, and the man as the conduit, right? The actual body of the man, but
Right.
which is the body of
Because
Christ.
he has to stay in the body.
Yeah, it's totally important.
So he has to remain, there has to remain a connection to earth. This isn't Gnosticism, right?
Mm-mm. Well, that's what's so interesting about the church being called the body. Like, if you really think about
Right,
that,
exactly.
people forget that all the time, right? The church is the actual body
We're
of
the
Christ.
body of Christ.
Yeah.
Yes, and Christ is the all human.
And the body is the what? It's the doing thing. right? It's got the arms and the legs, and
Yeah,
it's motoring
exactly.
around. Like it's not.
Right.
And
And I'm saying this, by the way, Shari. I'm saying this, by the way, Shari. One of the reasons it's so clear to me is because it's very easy to see from his position of self-critique. It's like, what I'm not really a man of action by nature. I'm a person who is very much likes to talk about things and think about things, but I'm not necessarily the quickest to act.
Well, I think we all suffer.
Although I can be impulsive at times. So
We all suffer from procrastination. I have a theory about that. It's an evolution.
Oh yeah, let's hear it.
It's a form of energy preservation. Right. So like, I mean, if you're a hunter-gatherer and it's really cold outside and you're just doing all you can to stay warm and you have food, you don't do anything until the food starts running out, and then you go and get more food, right?
Gotcha.
You have to conserve your energy until it's necessary to use it for your own survival. So, and that's how we operate. We people say it all the time, I work best under pressure. Well, that pressure is when suddenly your life is threatened by not getting this thing done, right? That's my theory.
I read an interview years ago with Peter Gabriel talking about creativity. He said, trust me, if somebody came up to you and said, come up with a great work of art in a year or I'll shoot you. You better believe you get on the case, right?
Yep.
And in fact, I just had to exert my will a second ago to tell my boys to knock it off. They were fighting in the next room. But the thing I think that's interesting to me about his part of his discussion of the will is this immediacy of it. If the Constitution, I mean, he talks about St. Joseph. Well, actually, I think I made a note about it. He was talking about Abraham getting up and leaving, right? Same with St. Joseph, right?
Yeah.
The guy who doesn't have one line in the New Testament,
Right.
Not one. He doesn't say one word. And when the angel says, take the child and his mother and flee into Egypt, he doesn't go, well, what about my office? What about my carpentry business? How are we going to pay for this? With the things we would say.
And it's fleeing into Egypt of all places.
And he gets up and goes.
Yeah, right.
He doesn't even go, okay, well, are you sure? That sounds kind of nuts to me, right? He just gets up and goes.
I literally had that experience. I was 17 years old. I was back at home after having been absent. Was I 17? 17, 16, 17, anyway. And I had this sense that I need to go, just go. It was April, it was late spring or early spring, and it was warm that day, and I was wearing a sweater. And I thought, okay. And I wrote on a note, got itchy feet, went west, and put it in my locker. And I walked out to the highway and I stuck out my thumb. And this girl that I had classes with, but I didn't know her very well. She came along and she goes, what are you doing? I'm standing there in front of the school like this. She goes, what are you doing? And I said, I'm going out west. Why? I don't know.
Right.
What are you going to do there? I don't know. I just have to go. And she goes, can I come? And I said, as long as you're not a burden, you can come with me. And so she joined me. And we went all the way. We went to Calgary, and that's another whole adventure. But I had an impulse, a very strong impulse to just go. Maybe, a millennia ago, I would have been considered some kind of, desert mother. But at the time I was a rebellious teenager. But I can't shake the fact that I was actually compelled to go. It was like, I didn't know anything and I had no fear and I wasn't trying to prove any point. It was just simply go.
Right. This is where the role of the moral reasoning comes into play. And that's why he emphasizes it, right? Because you need to be able to distinguish when you're simply being led by an impulse of the passions, and when you're actually being led by your will, and it's actually it's actually God that's telling you to do something, or it's the connection to the spiritual world that's telling you to do something. So you have to, in order to be able to distinguish between those things, that's where the moral reasoning comes into play. It's of indispensable value.
For some reason, I can't presume that God told me to do that. So I just want to clarify that.
No, that's fine. It still works as an example.
But it was really being compelled to do that. Like,
what does your moral reasoning tell you about whether it was God telling you to do that or not? I think it was what
God.
was the
That's my
right.
inner, that's my
Right.
inner
So
voice.
right, what was the final cause of this path of action? Like,
Well, I can't say it was a great, like Abraham's story wasn't great either, like
right.
he did some dumb things.
And Abraham wasn't perfect.
Right. And same here.
And
Same
neither
here.
was David.
But I think that all of those experiences from that moment on made me, right? So, and it's like he says here, how does he put that? I don't know if I have this page again, but he says the last thing that you get is understanding, right?
Right.
That's
And
the last
if
thing
you get it, you may
If
not
you get
ever understand
if
it.
you get it. Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah. We were going to talk about the walking on the water thing, and we got sidetracked.
No, I think we did talk about it. We could go into it a little bit more if you wanted to. I think that the part that's interesting to me is the way he talks about the esoteric meaning, which I've kind of have hinted at before in previous conversations that we've had on it. Now I got to find where it is though. Hold on a second. Oop. Searching the wrong direction. Oh, there we go. So so we already talked about we all know the story, right? So this is sort of his conclusion toward it to that section. It starts with let's see, it can walk on water is at the top of the page.
I think are you going to read thus there is another field of gravitation than that of?
No, I'm actually the part I'm gonna read is actually like just really short. It starts with ego sum nolite temere.
Oh, I see it. That's page
311.
311. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nate, you
Ego
gotta get the
sum
book.
nolite temere means to say, therefore, I am gravitation. Just as he's talking about the meaning of it being, I am, be not afraid, as opposed to it is I, be not afraid. It means to say, therefore, I am gravitation. Just as the sun in the visible world bears itself and attracts the planet, so I am the true son of the invisible world who bears himself and attracts and supports other beings. Do not be afraid, for I am. Yet Jesus walking on the water reveals still another mystery than that of the son of the spiritual world, the center of celestial gravitation. For not only did he stand on the water, which would suffice to reveal and demonstrate this truth, but he also walked on the water, i.e., he moved in a quite definite direction in the horizontal sense. He walked toward the boat in which his disciples rowed. There is in his walking toward the boat already contained in germ, essentially revealing it, his whole work, temporal and eternal, i.e., his sacrifices, resurrection, and all that is implied in his promise, lo, I am with you always until the end of the world. Matthew 23:20. The boat with his disciples is therefore and will be until the end of the world the aim of I am walking on the water. His instancy, his profound centering in himself, does not distance him from the navigators on the agitated sea of history and evolution, and does not make him disappear into the other sea, the calm sea of nirvana, but rather, on the contrary, it entails that he walks until the end of the world after the boat with his disciples.
No. You guys remember
Oh, Michael's.
I don't know, it was 20 years ago, but there was some wacky Japanese. My connection is unstable.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear
Yeah,
you.
we hear
We,
you.
we can hear you,
Am I
but your
back?
video is frozen. So you're like a voice from the heavens right now.
That's how I like to think of myself. But, do you remember that,
Oh, we're getting some motion back, but now the
that
audio is
wacky
garbled.
cult in Japan to Subway? Okay.
Wacky cult that was what?
In Japan,
Uh-huh.
that they tried to blow up a subway.
Oh, okay.
I don't remember.
No, what was that about?
Maybe 20 years ago.
Mhm.
And there was he wrote before this all happened, and he was levitating. They had a photograph of him levitating,
Okay, okay.
but the dude looked like he was in so much pain to make himself levitate. It was like, like he was really trying, right? And this discussion about levitation, and you think of Joseph of Cupertino, who just started, or Saint Teresa of Avila, who would just spontaneously start levitating because of their attraction to the Lord, right?
Mhm.
Whereas these other kind of occultist levitators, it becomes an act of their will in a way, but it's a perverse activity, so, and they both can be called levitation, but how are they qualitatively different?
Well,
Right,
that's
and that's an important.
Yeah, he actually distinguishes between the levitation that you're talking about, and then also the levitation of mediums, and then the levitation of the saints is all being like distinct. The one you're talking about, where it talks about great effort, he attributes that to like basically the kind of like force of electricity that he talked about in the previous chapter that's associated with the energies of the serpent.
Mhm.
And I love the stories about Saint Teresa of Avila, who told the other nuns, if I start floating, you better sit on me. Like,
Right.
Wow.
Yeah.
don't want to attract attention to myself.
And it's not her choice. That's the other thing, is like it's the in the case of the kind of like active occultist levitation, it's like their will. And in the case of the medium is just taken over by some force that is not a celestial force necessarily.
Well, like, how do you think that that's related to this get up and go thing? Because I think it is, right? Like, he talks about Abraham, and then he talks about levitation and walking on water, and so those three things are connected.
Intentionality.
Yeah, and it's also, yeah, intentionality, and it's also an orientation, right, of completely following the will of the Father. Like,
that's really good, because you can see that, because in the case of the levitation of the saint, right, the cause of the levitation is the saint's alignment with the heavenly will, right?
Yeah.
And then in the case, but they don't have, it's not no will, right? It's a case of an alignment with their will, with the heavenly will. And the case of the occultist or sorcerer who's levitating, it's an act of their will, right? So they're not, there's no alignment of their will with heaven. So their action is just arbitrary, right? It's not guided by moral reasoning. It might be guided by logical reasoning or desire for power or any other, but it's definitely not guided by moral reasoning. And in the case of the medium, the medium is expressing no will at all. They're allowing their will to be completely subverted by the will of an entity that is not celestial.
Well, he makes that distinction about the psychic man. I can't remember what it said now. Remember?
Yeah, that's very early on in the chapter, where he talks about like the psychic man
Here, I have it.
kind of balances between. I think the psychic man would probably be like,
he who lives in equilibrium between the two gravitational fields is the psychic man, and lastly, the one who lives under the sway of the gravitation of heaven is the spiritual man.
So the psychic man is most of us, I would say.
Well, that is the psychic man seems to me like kind of like the guy who Maximus the Confessor is talking about. Yeah, most of us, who has the natural and the gnomic will going on at the same
Yeah,
time.
most of us. They're right. It's
Right.
like, so we're not like, most of us aren't like people who have, bargained with dark powers in order to maximize the enforcement of our will on earth, right? So like, I would say like, okay, so the people most associated with the carnal man, it's not, to me, it's like, it's not really, to me, it's more the people that are associated with great earthly power than it is the people that are just like driven by seeking pleasure, although that's certainly also going to attach it to the earth and it's not a good thing. But the truly carnal man is the man who becomes a great power in the earth because of their devotion to the principles of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
So Pharaoh, right? Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos.
I had a dream once years ago about, I knew that Jesus was coming the next day and I wanted to tell everybody. And so I just started running down the street, knocking on everyone's doors. And I was really excited. And I was like, knock, knock, knock. And the person would open the door and it'd say, Jesus is going to be here tomorrow. Jesus is coming tomorrow. I just wanted to let you know. And the first door I knocked on, the guy was like, just like foul language and real, like, I absolutely no interest in that. And I've got so much going on and it was, just absolute hatred of the idea that suddenly his life would be interrupted. It wasn't like Jesus, he hated Jesus. He just didn't want to stop doing what he was doing. And then the second door I knocked on, the person opened and they were like, oh crap, I've got a dentist appointment tomorrow, And then the third door, we were just like hugging and crying and rejoicing and dancing in the yard and I woke up from that dream and I'm like, oh, that's it. There's like three kinds of people.
Mhm.
That's it. There's three kinds of people. And it
Right.
seems like that's what he's describing here with these three.
Yeah, right.
Mhm.
And most of us are in the state of like,
Oh yeah, like the
That-
person in
that-
the middle of my dream was the one I
Mm.
related to the most,
it's like, I have, it's like, I'll make time to pray sometimes.
That's
know?
Mark Derrida talks about that. It talks about the non-arrival of the Messiah. It's because I'm a Jew, I would like the Messiah to come. But on the other hand, I kind of like living. I like what's going on. I don't want to be disrupted from this. So I want the Messiah to come, but I don't want the Messiah to come.
Right. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
true.
but he's always out there walking on the water.
Yeah.
Now, did
know-
you guys think about this? I did, and in fact, I noticed my gloss from years ago
Mhm.
talking about the different kinds of levitation. I kept thinking of that scene in The Exorcist when Reagan floats off the bed, right?
Yeah.
And I'm no expert on exorcism or possession, but I think that happens in cases of possession. I don't know if that was a dramatic, poetic license or what in the film. But I mean, I do know that people who've been possessed, exhibit extraordinary amounts of strength sometimes.
Mhm.
So, but it seems in that case, it seems their will is not their own anymore, right?
Right.
So,
Right. Which
So-
is what that's what the levitation of the medium is. And the medium is like also like they're like basically they're allowing themselves to be possessed for a time. while
Okay,
they're
so
doing
here's
the
a
work as
here's a
medium.
random thought. If this is something that you can actually will, let's say not from a good place or from a misguided position, would this be how megalithic structures were built? Like seriously, think about it. Like if people can levitate themselves, what could a group of people who understood this concept do?
Well, you can, okay, so it's still, you can still see how it is an expression of this principle of like the power of earthly gravitation being related to those who are great seekers of power, because like the domain of the earth is where they want to have their power. So in that sense, the answer is yes, because it requires someone, you know, of great power to like, well, of course, I don't know, because it seems a lot of these things were constructed for sake of reverence. So
I mean, like
I don't know if I want
the
to say
pyramids
that.
of Stonehenge kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, or
Yeah.
Easter Island, or, you know, like there's just so many huge stones moved from quarries so far away that they still can't really figure out how they got them there. And I remember
But we're advanced. Stop
of
it.
course, yes,
an
we're
advanced
totally advanced.
civilization.
Like, I'm just wondering how understood perhaps these psychic abilities were for people at one point in time, right? Like we're so divorced from the spiritual world that we think it's all a fairy tale.
I
right?
think. No, this is boys and girls. This is not in the book. But I think the thing to think about now, I've read this, and you know, is it poetic? What is it? So when Steiner, for instance, talks about civilization in Atlantis,
Yeah.
and for him, Jack and the Beanstalk is an example of that, because they exhibit power over growth. So throws out those seeds, the next morning goes all the way up to the sky, right?
Mhm.
So they knew how to control the power of growth, and we know that in the pyramids, for instance, there are wheat berries they found stored in jars in the pyramids that were still fertile.
Yeah.
That they actually so the other thing is, when Goethe talks about this, he talks about two forces. Now we talk about gravity a lot, right? So much in our civilization is based on gravity. I mean,
Oh yeah, I remember you talking about this
the
before.
way entropy, right, is
Yeah.
it's all based on gravity. But Goethe always goes like, hey, wait a minute, there's a counter force to gravity.
Levity.
Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned this before.
So I think now I'm guessing I am guessing that those historical personages who were able to move that stuff knew something about levity that we don't know,
I think so
that
too.
our science doesn't know. And because our science, as Tomberg says time and time again in this text, is a science of death,
Yeah.
not a science of life. And it occurred to me this week. So, you know, you guys know my mother has dementia. I don't know how long she's gonna last, but she's ailing for sure.
Hmm.
But I concluded I finally was able to put it into words, that our medical culture is not interested in the prolongation of life. It's interested in the prolongation of death,
Yes,
Yeah.
that's good.
you know? And which is what I think happened to my mom. I mean, I think she's lived longer than she was supposed to live, because she's kind of been on artificial life support of whatever kind, you know, through pharmacology.
Yeah.
Which is not fair. I mean, it's a long time she's lived in a debilitating way,
Yes.
you know, and a lot of people, and I think and we've seen this with the growth in dementia and Alzheimer's over the last couple of generations, is because scientists know how to prolong death, but they think they're prolonging life.
That's good.
It's not prolonging life.
Yeah.
So, and that's what, we've said before. I mean,
And Ivan Illich believed that so profoundly that he decided not to take measures to extend his own life when he got cancer.
right. There are worse things than dying, being a slave.
Yeah.
And so, this is why I think the science of the future, far future, will be a science that is a science of life and of levity, rather than of death, you know, or destruction. Like even the gasoline engine, right? It's a science of destruction of matter.
Mhm.
nuclear energy. It's all destruction.
And that gravity,
Wow.
gravity levity distinction is really the same thing that Tomberg is talking about by
Well, that's
just
what
talking
that's
about
what
two
I'm
different
getting at, yeah.
poles. If you have two different poles of
It is, yeah.
gravitation, then that's the same thing as talking about gravity and levity.
And that's, and I think that the point I'm making, I think it has more than theological or philosophical or religious implications.
Yeah,
You know,
I'm
it's
somewhat
funny.
hesitant to talk about that kind of stuff, but I do fundamentally agree with you, and I think that a lot of it has to do with a lot of why that people have such a hard time with that is that we aren't operating from the right paradigms in order to be able to see those possibilities.
Exactly.
Well, I think it's that same choice that Michael just, elucidated before earlier. I can't remember what the example was now, but where we're deliberating, right? What was that example you used where the guy's like, should I or shouldn't I?
Oh yeah, from Brave New World.
Right, Brave
Yeah,
New World.
right.
That's, it's like, oh, but I have this drug, and isn't it morally responsible of me or irresponsible of me to use or not use it, and so then you get into this quandary, right? And then you just do whatever the thing is that you're going to do next,
A gram is worth a damn.
Think of Yoda.
yeah.
Do or do not. There
Whenever
is
I
no
think
try.
of levity, Michael, I think of that uncle in Mary Poppins who floats to the ceiling because he's laughing so hard, and then the
Yeah,
kids
there you
go,
go. That's levity, right?
yeah,
Quite
Yeah.
literally.
quite literally.
In every
Mary Poppins gets very angry with
In
him and
every
says he
sense.
shouldn't do that, and he needs to come down. And we have that tendency to kind of discourage
Notice how,
people
but see, here's the thing. You just
from
talked about
that.
Mary Poppins, and I just like I made a Yoda reference that kind of got swallowed by the conversation. But you can see in our stories, we still have we cannot lose our awareness of this in our stories. It's like
Yeah.
why do you think we keep putting these things in our stories?
And we dream about flying.
But
Right.
But P.L. Travers, who wrote Mary Poppins, she was really into Gurdjieff and esoteric spirituality.
Right.
Oh, really?
Might
Yeah.
not know.
I didn't know
And
that.
I think she was an anthroposophist for a while. At least she knew a lot of anthroposophy. She knew Steiner.
Makes
So
sense.
she knew Goethe.
Yeah.
Right? So
Mary
I'm
Poppins was
sure
constantly floating around.
it has something to do with it.
She's constantly floating, eh? Their umbrella.
Yeah.
But the point I was going to make there was, and Yoda is also a really good example, although I'm not as familiar with Star Wars stories as I am with Mary Poppins, but is just how people are constantly saying, yeah, you need to have both feet on the ground, you need to be more grounded, you need to come down off your high horse, you need to, like there's a lot of discouragement, right, in our culture, I think, to get people down, back on the ground. I mean, it has its place, but didn't Tomberg talk about the idealist as he talks about the idealist early in the book? I can't remember what chapter it is.
Well, he talks about basically the idealist realist duality being
Right. Yeah.
wrong,
Yeah.
along with several other dualities.
And I just thought I'd rather be the idealist, which is, kind of the person with the head in their head in the clouds.
Right. But here's the thing though, but I think so the hangman actually can also be used as an image to understand the idealist realist polarity too, right? Because as a human being, it's like you can't actually fully embody the ideal, right? But you need to be directed by the ideal to embody it as much as you can.
Yeah.
Because you're in that hangman state.
That's right.
At least in this world.
Yeah.
Until this world is no longer this world, but transformed, which I think is related to how many people learn to see the real world. Like that's when the world transforms.
Yeah.
when people start singing the new song that will summon the second coming.
I just happened to have a chat with Jess and Lance, and I think Luke jumped on, and
Mhm.
we were talking about this walking on the water thing.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize that it wasn't when, we often hear the story that when he stopped looking at Jesus, then he fell in the water, right? But it actually says that when he saw the wind,
Yeah.
he was afraid. And I thought, well, what is the wind? And then Jesus says to him, "Oh man of little faith, why did you doubt?" And I thought, actually, I wonder if Jesus is actually saying to him, "Why did you doubt yourself? Like, you can actually do this," right?
And how many times does Jesus say, "Why were you afraid?"
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
This is a lot.
A lot. And it seems like a self-doubt, like that, we get the Sunday school story is, oh, keep your eyes on Jesus, right? And then you'll be able to walk on the water. But what if it's just have faith in your own ability to do this?
Well,
Like,
how
it
many
is your
things?
faith that has healed you, right?
How many
Yeah,
things do we
right.
collectively not even attempt because we are constantly told you can't?
Mhm.
It's impossible. That's a form of fear. It really is. It's like we can't have peace on earth. It's impossible.
Yeah, that's evil
It'll
and
never
fear.
happen.
That's warmongering
Right.
and fear.
Right, exactly.
That's people who don't want peace on earth. Yeah.
So
I know I had a discussion with my students about a year ago. I said, how can there still be war? How is it even possible?
yeah, how are we on the brink of World War III?
Yeah, and how can we be? Yeah, we call ourselves a civilized society. What's your
Yeah,
evidence?
but I don't. Yeah. I don't even. Civilization. I want to talk about that for a second. It's like someone said something on Twitter the other day about civilization. It's like you can't have civilization without experts or something like that. I think it was Paul Leitner who said it, and I kind of like pushed back at him a little bit. I like Paul. Nothing
You
against
can't
Paul.
have civilization without experts.
Yeah. Well, this isn't what like this was implicit in
Okay.
several things that he said. So I'm kind of extracting out. This is not even remotely we had a little exchange where he was talking about the need for expertise, and I'm like, no, we need virtuosity, not expertise, because expertise is disembodied and worthless.
Yes.
And then he said something about plumbers, and I said, yeah, perfect example. A plumber actually has embodied virtuosity. It can actually do something in the world. Someone who has a PhD in plumbing and can't fix your toilet is worthless.
Yeah, I know. That's what my
Right.
son is a
So
designer, right? And they say that's the problem. Mechanics and designers don't get along.
But part of the exchange,
Theory
he
and
was
practice.
talking about, he was saying that civilization depends on expertise. And I'm like, I said, I'm not sure civilization is such a good concept.
Oh,
Because to me, civilization is related to, I mean,
Tubal Cain.
Civitas, it's related to the polis, it's related to the city, it's related to political order, right? So it's a structure of man, and it's directly connected to the principles of this world, which is under the dominion of the prince of this world. So
Yes.
I don't think civilization is what we're looking for.
We're aiming at. Yeah.
It's not what we're aiming for. It's something that transcends that. It's the kingdom. The kingdom is not a civilization.
Well, it's the in between, according to the hangman, right? It's somewhere in between there.
Yeah, it's interesting. Positivism, right? The great book by Soloviev, Against the Positivists.
Mm-hmm.
I had a discussion with my students this week. In fact, speaking of Ivan Illich, we're reading his book ABC. Do you know that one? Which is about the alphabetization of the mind.
Gotcha.
And it's a course on theories of writing. And so we're reading this. He's talking about the development from oral cultures to written to manuscript cultures, etc. And I kept saying this, and I said, okay, do you think we're any better off than when 90% of people were illiterate? Do you think writing has actually made anything better?
Right.
No. I mean, we assume at first, yes. Okay. Give me one way.
Right.
It's one way.
Yeah. No, I
it
think
made
that's
people's
like
lives better.
I think that's why I think Martin Shaw is so awesome, because I think that's really a lot of what he's doing is trying to, like, even in his writing, he's trying to bring back a sense of orality, and obviously in his oral storytelling.
Well, I think we're headed there anyways, because most people are just
Yeah.
listening. They're listening to things, and they're not really good at writing or reading.
But and it's that, I mean, the interesting though is, and we don't think, it's another thing we don't think about the pervasiveness of technology, and not just the internet and stuff, but radio and television going back, most of the 20th century, is that we don't think about what it does to language. But then you read a play by Shakespeare, and students are intimidated as hell by reading Shakespeare. But then I tell them, listen, when these plays were out, 90% of the people in the audience were illiterate.
Yeah, poetry and drama are different though, because poetry and drama are somehow more embodied than other forms of writing. And also they're not as disconnected from morality either, because they're definitely, like, they're intended to be spoken.
But they're also the two things students say they can't understand when you ask them to engage.
Right.
And so my question was, why do you, what did they have that we don't have, or what do we have that they didn't have? Why is it so hard for us? And I think, and this is, now this, we're way off in the weeds now, but I think it has to do with kind of, we can call it the homogenization of language we get through our various forms of media, which flatten the language. Where in Shakespeare's London, you could hear how many different dialects and subdialects and idioms and sub-idioms just within walking distance of wherever he lived in London.
Yeah.
So I think, so we don't think about these things, and we
lose the nuances. We lose the nuances of words too sometimes because of that, where it's like words become synonyms that didn't used to be synonyms. Where it's like, because of that flattening of meaning.
We never think about with one introduction of the introduction of this or that new technology, whether it's a new technology in teaching, and I don't necessarily mean electronic technology, like a new method. We never, ever think about what's in danger of being lost.
And the reason for that, I think, to just get it back to what some of the things that Tomberg says in this chapter, is to do with this idea of logical reasoning being operating in the realm of quantity, and moral reasoning in the realm of quality. So when you have a loss of moral reasoning, you have a loss of quality. And that's what allows you to go upon that path.
Can you define what he means by moral reasoning here? I think I know, but I just want to hear what you think.
Yeah, moral reasoning is thinking about the good. It's that simple.
Okay.
And I think
The good as such.
I think this is where doesn't address that, but I think this addresses that question of culture we were just talking about indirectly, but it's on page 320.
Okay.
When he says, this is the principal point of practical Hermeticism, and at the same time, its contribution to Christian mysticism. I say Christian mysticism and not Christian mystical theology, because theology rationalizes the material of mystical experience in deriving rules and laws, whilst Hermeticism wants thought and imagination to participate in this experience. Its aim is found in the experience itself, not in the domain of explaining it or accounting for it.
Right.
So that, and he talks about,
and then he has some harsh words for theologians.
Yes.
I just had a conversation with Jed about this, mystical theology, or mysticism and theology, and yeah, that stood out to me.
Well, that's in fact, I had a couple weeks ago, I gave a talk at Cambridge via Zoom on about Pablo Florensky. One of the things and they were all, most of them were Orthodox, they were all Christians. And I said, what makes us think, that the dogmas we have received were complete? So Sophia, for instance. So we have like Florensky or Soloviev or even Thomas Merton, who have these Sophianic intuitions, right?
Yeah.
Sophia, there's a thing, or Margaret Barker, or me. And
Mhm.
but the thing is, then you look at the available structure of the of dogmatics, and it's like, well, it doesn't fit with the Trinity. Well, we could put it there, but it becomes a fourth hypostasis, and that's going to screw everybody up. But let's put it doesn't fit over there either.
Yeah.
Where do we put this?
Yeah.
Where do you put it? I said, but the thing is, I mean, are we not obligated I was speaking as a theologian at that moment. I said, we are not obligated as people who have the capacity for critical thinking and intuition to say maybe something's wrong and we can't be held to this structure that was devised as just an Aristotelian application or retrofitting Christianity, which Aristotelianism way back in the day. And they're like,
I was going to say, and they all went,
well, they actually we had a good discussion about it, but I think
although it's much more compatible with the earlier traditions, which were much more wedded to Platonism.
but it was stunning because people when they're like, what do we do now?
yeah.
Because and I think what happens is, and this is what I think Tomberg's arguing for right here, is the spontaneity, the organicness of the religious intuition gets destroyed in a way, or
Well,
like
there's
Gurdjieff calls it turning a wild animal into a domesticated animal.
Right. There's that get up and go thing again, right? Like
Spontaneity, yeah.
Yeah, it's like, okay, all you
I can't do
theologians,
that.
time to get up and go.
I could get in trouble. Right. So, and that's what Tomberg, I don't know if it was in this chapter, but where he talks about the blood colors it, right? You have this clear thing, and then all of a sudden you get the thinking going, and the blood taints or colors the pure thinking because it's been compromised in a way by
well, he offers succor for those who might be accused of heresy, but who are actually in this kind of alignment that is a true and active faith that he's talking about, because that's what ultimately what he's tying this idea of the hangman to is the person of faith, right? And so he says you might be accused of heresy, but you can't possibly, if you're in that state, you can't possibly commit heresy.
Yeah.
Which is the way he interprets the true meaning of papal infallibility when speaking ex cathedra.
Right. And here, like earlier, when he has a brief foray and a powerful one into universalism, apocalypse.
Yeah,
right?
he does.
And which is powerful, which technically speaking is heresy.
Right.
Right. And
although he avoids technical heresy by he in the way he expresses it technically, because he still he affirms eternal hell, but he just offers an understanding of it that is compatible with apocalypse.
Right.
I can't say that word.
I can't help but think of David Bentley Hart, right? I can't think of it, help but think of him. And
yeah.
And this is one of the things I propose in my talk at Cambridge is, well, you have to admit that some of his proposals are pretty heretical.
Right.
I think they're going to come from, some, like people have accused Bulgakov of heresy.
Right.
Right. So own it. Because I think there's a tendency amongst theologians, well, we're going to find some clause in here that we can try to make it prove what the dogmatic tradition of the church teaches us. But I'm more, well, why don't you just own it?
Well,
and quit playing around. I get accused online.
The history of the church, the history of the church tells us that today's heresy might be tomorrow's orthodoxy, though. So
I'm cool with that, but I think people trying to prove that, it's a weird thing to me. I mean, I understand the desire for something that is secure and unmovable, right? That you can count on to be there. But I don't think we have that. And I think we tell ourselves that we have that in all of the church structures available to us.
Right.
that just does not exist and it never has.
Right. The only
Um,
kind of certainty of the absolute that we have is that which we have seen and experienced.
And that's actually where Florensky starts off his book, The Pillar and Ground of the Truth, in personal experience, personal religious experience.
I bought that book, by the way.
And that's where Tomberg grounds it too. It's
Yeah.
like it's
Well, you know, I don't know if you know this, but do you know, did we talk about this before? That Tomberg, I think his model was the Pillar and
Yeah,
Ground.
Yeah, you mentioned
we
it
did
last
talk
time,
about
and
that,
I
yeah.
ordered the book, the Florensky book for myself.
It's worth it. It's a really powerful. In fact, when I was rereading it to do this talk I gave a couple weeks ago, I was like, wow, this is even better than I remember.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
kid
Yeah,
done
I saw how many notes you had in your
a
copy.
gazillion. Yeah, wait, I'll show you again. Just a couple.
Yeah, just a couple.
They'd fly away if I put any more on there. It's like,
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you both for joining me this morning. Looking forward to our next foray. I think our next, just to give a little preview to the audience, letter 13, which is death, will be our next conversation.
Right, and I just wanted to read something on that note that he
Oh,
says.
go for it.
This chapter, okay. We have said the hangman is the 13th. Now, to be the 13th can signify two things: either the reduction of the 12 to 1, and then the hangman represents the fundamental unity of the 12 modalities of will, or else the crystallization of a 13th synthetic element. In the latter case, it would be a matter of a skeleton, which is the last synthetic crystallization of zodiacal will, and which is both the principal and concrete image of death. As death and its relationship to the skeleton will be the subject of the following letter on the 13th arcanum of the tarot. Death, I ask you, dear unknown friend, to remember the context of the two problems as indicated here, namely the problem of the identity of individual will with divine will, and the problem of attraction from above in its double aspect of ecstasy and death. For it is both in ecstasy and in the case of natural death that the zodiacalization of the will takes place. With respect to the hanged man, he represents the first alternative, i.e., the fundamental unity of the 12 modalities of divine will, which are the effective and final causes of radiation, expansion, mobility, and stability, spiritual, psychic, and material. And then at the bottom, he reads from the Rig Veda, and then he says, it is this profound sphere from whence the anonymous author of the Vedic hymn drew his inspiration, in which the hanged man participates through his will. He is the link between being and non-being, between darkness and created light. He is found suspended between the potential and the real, and it is the potential which is more real for him than the real, properly said. He lives by authentic faith. And when I was reading this part of the book, the chapter, I was thinking, and I don't know enough about Heidegger but Michael might be able to help me out here. I was thinking about Heidegger's idea of being towards death. Is this essentially what, oh, can't hear you.
being hurled towards death.
Yeah, or being towards death. Heidegger talks about being towards death, right?
Being hurled, thrown towards death.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Well, for him, it means we're that's a condition we are all in and that we all run away from. So, but then when we finally accept it is when we can ultimately come to what he calls storge, or caring.
Right. Okay, that's
Because
okay.
we're no
So it's
longer, because you see
connected to
people
care.
who do this, right? So they experiment with different personas, like, okay, I'm a socialist. And so they get all into being a socialist. And then they're all, now I'm a neocon. That one didn't work out. Okay. So and they thrust themselves into those things, which Heidegger interprets as running away from death, as a kind of seeking immortality.
Right. Okay.
But then when they finally exhaust that, if they do, they finally come into their humanity. And the result of that is you see a caring person arise from that. That's what he's saying.
Right. Okay. Okay.
Heidegger's in a way religion without religion.
Yeah. Yeah.
So who is the hangman?
Who?
Sherry, who is the hangman? I just wanted to give you a chance for Jess's sake, if you wanted to share the very end of the
Well,
chapter.
yes, this is so good. I have a big
This is we're sharing this on for our friend Jess, who is a wonder that has spent a lifetime thinking about the book of Job and considering its mysteries and thinking about it in a very deep and interesting way. You should definitely watch Jess's conversations with Shari on the book of Job. They're fantastic.
Okay, well, the last part of the book of chapter, the very end, he says, who is the hangman? Is he a saint, a righteous man, an initiate? He can certainly be regarded as all three, for all three have in common that their will is an organ of heaven. But what he is mostly, what he represents individually, is neither sanctity nor righteousness nor initiation, but something which is their synthesis. The hanged man is the eternal Job, tried and tested from century to century, who represents humanity towards God and God towards humanity. The hanged man is the truly human man, and his lot is a truly human one. The hanged man is the representative of humanity who is found between two kingdoms, that of this world and that of heaven, and that which is truly human in man and in humanity is the hanged man. And it is the hanged man who said thousands of years ago, has not man a hard destiny upon earth, and are not his days like the days of a hireling, like a slave who longs for the shadow, and like a hireling who looks for his wages? Oh, that my words were written, oh, that they were inscribed in a book, oh, that with an iron pen and lead they were graven in the rock forever. My foot has held fast to his steps. I have kept his way and have not turned aside. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at last he will stand upon the earth, and after my skin has been destroyed, then from my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see on my side, and my eyes shall behold, and not another. My heart faints within me in expectation. This is the discourse of the hanged man across the centuries. And, you know, while we were having that conversation the other day, Jess and Lance and Luke and Ironroot or Manuel jumped in. And he said, tell me why you think the book of Job is so important. And I had excused myself and came back into the room, and they were trying to hash that out. And I said, what's the question? And then he said, why should I read it? Why do I care about it? What's so good about it? And I said, because it's the story of humanity fulfilling the role that God made them to do, mediating between heaven and earth, and coming to terms with what it means to be in the world, right? And that's it. That's what the hanged man is.
And the friends are all
sure.
Orthodox theologians.
Yep.
They represent the
friends?
orthodoxy of their day.
Absolutely.
100%. And they give learned opinions that are absolutely well informed by the orthodoxy of their day, and God takes the side of Job.
Yeah, and ultimately they were valid yet worthless opinions. Ultimately worthless.
You know what's really interesting about the friends is that if you actually look deeply into what they're saying, it is a mechanistic worldview. They think that if they do such and such, that God will respond to them in such and such a way. Yeah. And so it's a cause and effect viewpoint. And that's how old the mechanistic worldview is.
That's right.
God is a vending machine. If I put in the dollar, I get the chips or the pop, right? And it's always predictable, and it always depends on me, not God. Okay. And in the book of Job, God shows up in a whirlwind.
And that's the problem with Calvinism, right? It's a legalist.
Yes.
Right. And of course, why wouldn't it be? John Calvin was a lawyer.
Yeah. It's about ordering right? It's about believing that the order is something you can see. That's why they think that the righteous prosper and the wicked suffer, because it's visible. It's visible to you, right? Oh, he must be righteous because he's what? Prospering. And he must be wicked because look, he's a leper. He's covered in sores and he lost everything. His wife left him. He has no house. It's because he's
Makes
wicked.
it easy.
Right?
Makes it easy.
And it's totally simple. Like, what's so different, you know? And I hear that kind of logic from people on that side of the equation. They say things like, it's just so easy. It's so simple. It's obvious. You know, you don't even have to think about it. You can, yeah.
Well, but that's logical
And,
reason, but that's logical reasoning and not moral reasoning.
Right.
They're lacking in moral reasoning.
Right.
They really are.
Right. And the thing is, like,
Anyone
chaos,
anyone who believes that a God of love is the creator of an eternal a torture chamber of eternal conscious torment they may be able to believe that in accordance with their logical reasoning, but their moral reasoning will tell them that they're being preposterous and that such an idea is monstrous.
He's a God like that. That's not a God I can get with.
Right. And
No.
they'll just tell you that you're being prideful and not humble enough. But God wants obedience and not submission, and they're not the same thing, and you need to learn the difference.
Amen.
All right.
Yeah, amen.
That's a powerful note to end on.
That was powerful. I'm gonna go wash my house now.
All right. Thank you. Thank you both for joining me today.
Take care.